Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the slight delay. I'm Nancy Stote, the Framingham's Media and Program Specialist. We're happy to welcome everyone here today in person, as well as those folks who are watching from home. We're thrilled you were able to join us for our monthly Lunchtime Learning Series. If you know someone who couldn't be here today or watching it live, the program will remain on YouTube, our YouTube page, so you can go back and rewatch it or watch it for the first time. We're very excited to have with us today Anna Tucker, Executive Director of the Framingham History Center. Anna's topic is preserving family treasures. A few announcements before we start the program. We'd just like you to please silence your cell phones. And the talk will be about 40 minutes. If you have questions, we will have a question and answer period at the end. Just one thing in the back, we have evaluation forms. We'd love if you give us your opinion about this program or suggestions for future programs. And we hope you can join us for the next July Lunchtime Learning Series. That will be Let's Talk Birdie on July 7th with Susan Moranjo of Wild Birds Unlimited. And with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Anna Tucker.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Nancy. And I'll definitely have to be joining again in July. That sounds like a wonderful program. Oh, we're just, excellent. Thank you. Oh, this actually works both here and online, I believe. Well, thank you again, Nancy, for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here with everyone, both in person and online, to talk about one of my very favorite subjects, which is how to preserve your family history. And so we'll talk about everything from some of the practical at-home tips. How do you actually preserve those photographs and those documents and those glass and ceramic treasures that your family has passed down from generation to generation? But we'll also talk about how do we preserve the stories that we have connected to those objects as well? How do we both transfer it from what we've heard and learned onto the next generation or to our family and friends around us as well? So it's a pretty tall order for a subject to talk about how do you preserve your family history. So what I really hope today is it sparks a conversation. It starts us thinking about what are the principles, what are a few practical tools and techniques that we can use, and then we can start digging into it a little bit more deeply together, both at the Framingham History Center and here at the Framingham Public Library. So I'm so honored and thankful to the Framingham Public Library to offer this sort of series. And as we were discussing today, it's a great opportunity to be here in person with the central air as it's getting a little bit warm outside. So I'm just very, very delighted to be here. So before I get into a little bit more of an in-depth overview of what we'll talk about over the next 35 to 45 minutes or so, I wanted to talk a little bit about where I come from and also the Framingham History Center and the role that we would like to play in helping you preserve your own family history and your family treasures. So how many of you in the audience, if you'd raise your hand, have been to the Framingham History Center? All right, I see a fair number. I also see a number of people, especially one in particular who's helped steward and lead the Framingham History Center, and I'm sure those online hopefully have been there before. The Framingham History Center is an institution that was established in 1888. So for 135 years, as of this year, we have been dedicated to preserving and sharing the history of Framingham and the region as well. And we do that for a very specific reason, because it both preserves the history and it creates connections in the community. It helps craft that sense of belonging and community that's so essential to who we are in Framingham. The way that we do that at the Framingham History Center is we provide exhibitions, we provide programming and events, and we also historically preserve 3 buildings, which you see up here on the screen, as well as a 10,000-piece artifact collection. So on the left-hand side, you see the Academy, which was established or opened rather in 1837, and that served both as an academy, as its name suggests at the beginning, and now it's our on-site research center, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a moment. In the center is Edgell Memorial Library, which many of you might know by the iconic statue out front. So that is actually, we're celebrating the 150th dedication anniversary of Edgell Memorial Library this year. That is the site of the exhibitions that we have on site, and again, I'll talk about that in just a moment. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll be able to see the Village Hall on the Common, which was built in 1834. And this was actually the second town hall in Framingham. And so it was a site of conversations, of discussions over the years, and I've heard many other different functions that the Village Hall had, everything from a cafeteria to a dance hall, and also a place apparently when the fire carriages were horse-drawn, where those would be stored as well. So the Village Hall is our event space. As you can see, it has many, many layers of history. So one of the things that I wanted to point out that we do provide at the Framingham History Center is direct access to the objects and treasures of Framingham and Framingham's past as well. So on the screen, you'll see a photo of our reading room, which is located at the Academy. I see we have one of our researchers here as well, who's been very, very helpful over the years for interpreting and collecting the collection at the Framingham History Center. And the Academy is open on Thursdays for people to come in and ask questions about their background, about the apartment or house where they may live, and also about any subjects that might come to mind about the history of Framingham as well. So we definitely want to invite you and welcome you to come here and discuss a little bit more about your interests and your questions about Framingham. So just to go back at the Framingham History Center as a whole, we have some exciting things coming up. So this year we just launched our Hikes Through History and our Crafting with History series. So that's a way of sort of getting hands-on with history and learning some things at the same time. We just, and I think a few of you were also on the tour, for the house tour. We had our 20th anniversary this year, so we were able to bring it back in person, which is very exciting. And at the end of September, we're opening our first on-site exhibition since 2019, which is called Collective Journeys. And it's all about global migration to Framingham from 1960 until present. So we have a lot of exciting things that are going on at the Framingham History Center, and we would be honored for you to join us for those. So I wanted to give a little bit of a background about why am I so invested and excited about preserving family histories and family stories. So again, my name is Anna. I'm the executive director at the Framingham History Center. And I just celebrated my 1-year anniversary of moving up here, which is very exciting. I can tell, and I could tell from day one, it was the exact right decision. But my entire professional career over the last 15 years has been dedicated to preserving community histories, to the study of history, specifically within the museum field. So I first began at the Museum of History and Holocaust Education as assistant manager, where we started collecting oral histories of both Holocaust survivors and World War II and home front workers. And I saw then how important objects were to helping to tell a story. A lot of times we would conduct an oral history, which is a recorded interview with someone, and they would bring in these items with them to help them tell the story. Sometimes they were medals, sometimes they were letters, sometimes they were photographs, and I saw how pivotal these items were to telling this story to us over the years. So I stayed with the Museum of History and Holocaust Education for several years, and while I was there, we established the Department of Museums, Archives, and Rare Books at Kennesaw State University, which was a new department, and I was honored to serve on the executive team that oversaw that. So it included both the Holocaust Museum, but also the University Archives, a Rare Book Museum, and a Contemporary Art Museum. And again, at each one of these units, I saw the power of an object to help tell a story. And it wasn't necessarily the intrinsic value of the object itself that was important, though that sometimes was, but it was the stories that people would wrap around them, sort of what became of the object through the years as it was passed down from person to person. So after my time at MARB, as we called it, over a decade, I ended up moving to New Orleans to the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, where I helped open the new museum in New Orleans. And there I served as the founding curator and the project manager that oversaw the opening of this new museum. And it was perhaps here more than ever that I saw the essential need for families to be able to preserve their own stories. So at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience, we were tasked with with helping to preserve and interpret the stories across hundreds of years and across 13 states for Jewish families within the American South. And of course, we were a repository, but there was no way that we could hold every single person's story, within our 13,000 square foot space. And so we wanted to see what ways are there that we can help guide people in preserving their own family histories wherever they may live. And so while I was there, I worked with several families and individuals on organizing and interpreting their own family collections while they remained within the ownership of that family. And through that process, not only was it fantastic for the museum, we were able to learn new information, get more context, but we saw how meaningful it was to the family to be able to start interpreting their own history and be able to start passing it along and thinking about what do we do with these objects once they pass out of our care. Because for many of us, we're sort of the de facto historians of our family. And raise your hand if you're kind of that person in the family who loves the history. Yep, I see many hands in the audience. And mysteriously, letters come to you, or you're at family reunions and someone's like, oh, here's this thing I found in my attic. I thought you'd want it. So really this talk is in many ways for those of us who are the de facto historians of our own family history in terms of what we might be able to do with that. So today's discussion, there are a few different levels of it. The first thing I wanted to start with is a 30,000-foot perspective of what are the top tips of preservation? What are the things that almost no matter what we can encounter, these are things that we want to think about as we're preserving our family history. After we look at those top 4 tips, we'll then dig down into very practical at-home preservation tips. These are very basic tools to help you preserve some of the most common types of artifacts and treasures that might be in your possession. These are the photographs, these are the documents, these are the ceramics and maybe textiles that have been passed along to you. So this will give you some readily available tools for you to start preserving those treasures. But then the second half is, maybe second, third, I should say, I really want to focus on how do you preserve the future of this history. So you're doing the hard work of preserving it. What happens to it in the future? How can you start preparing it, your past essentially for its future? And then going on to creating or crafting your family narrative. So as I said at the beginning, this is a very tall order for a conversation. So I know we won't be able to get into all of it over the next 30 to 35 minutes or so, but it hopefully will start sparking some ideas and conversations. And again, at the Framingham History Center, we would love to continue this conversation with you. So one of the things I wanted to talk about before we started is what is preservation and why is it important? Some of you might have heard the word conservation and preservation possibly in the audience, and there's sometimes a little bit of confusion over, am I conserving something? Am I preserving something? An easy way that I like to think about it is both conservation and preservation have to do with elongating the life of the item in your care. What conservation does is it elongates the life of that item by directly modifying the item. So say you have a painting and there's some peeling, there might be some mildew damage, it would go to a conservator, and that conservator would actually physically alter the painting in order to elongate its life and preserve its life. On the other hand, preservation elongates the life of an item through altering its environment. So it might take that painting and put it into an environment where the temperature is a little bit more controlled, which we'll talk about in a second, maybe remove it from humidity or light, but it doesn't physically alter the nature or the state of that item. Conservationists, especially working at a museum, are some of the most essential people to elongating the life of an item, but they're really professionals. In a lot of ways, they're almost artists and scientists, sort of like translators, where they can see how far they need to go in terms of altering the structure of that item. So today's conversation is really focusing on the preservation. How can we alter the environment of the object? So don't worry, I'm not going to start asking you to, don some gloves and some chemical paints and get to work on your great-grandmother's portrait. So do not worry, that is not going to be something I'm tasking you with by the end of this program. But one of the reasons I wanted to talk about the importance of preservation is because, as I hinted to at the beginning of this conversation, it is one of the most important ways that we pass down stories. So a lot of times we have written histories, we have oral histories, and then we have histories that sort of combine those two together. And these items are a way to create connections both with your family and with your friends, but also with the future as well. And preservation can certainly be practical, and I'll give you some practical tips, but in a lot of ways, the heart of it is about preserving the stories of these objects and of these items as well. So when we're talking about preservation, it's really a preservation of these narratives and these stories that we want to share with others. So that's why the component of creating family histories is essential when we talk about preservation as well. So as I mentioned, we'll look at a very 30,000-foot perspective for these top tips for preservation itself. And I'm actually going to jump right into it. So as you can see on the screen, there are 4 top tips or things that I want you to think about when we think about altering the environment of this object. The first one I want to talk about is temperature. Now, as we're experiencing today, we don't like it when it's overly hot or overly cold. You know, I would say, I will speak for myself, even though I just moved from New Orleans, I don't like to be out in super hot weather. Likewise, I don't like to be out in super cold weather. Our artifacts and the treasures in our family collections are exactly the same. They don't like these big temperature extremes. So one of the top tips is that you want to create a stable environment for the item in your care. So the Smithsonian standard is that the temperature should be around 65 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. I say that, and I know that's really hard to get within that window. So what I'd like to emphasize right now and throughout the talk is it's really about creating stability. So it's making sure that there aren't huge fluctuations between the temperatures. And some of the places that we see the biggest swings of temperature often happen to be in the attics or in the basements. So the attics in the summers, of course, can get very, very warm. Basements in the winter can get very, very cold. So one of the things that I again want to impress about temperature is we want to move them to a space where there aren't those big swings in temperature, because it's not really the high temperatures or the low temperatures that damage items. It's when you swing between the two over a shorter period of time. The other thing that I want to talk about is light. So light degrades. We all think about how important it is to put sunscreen on our skin. I've tried to remind myself of that every single day. Our artifacts also degrade with light. Now, I'm not saying that you should put sunscreen, again, on your great-grandmother's portrait. Please don't do that. But light does degrade over time. And this happens actually with everything. You might suspect that, of course, with photographs. We've all seen with photographs turn a little bit gray or yellow. But this also happens with documents. It can happen with objects, even things that are wooden, and even metal over a very, very, very long period of time. So in museums, we actually have this mathematical formula that we use to calculate how long an object can remain on display and at what intensity of light as well. Now, certainly I'm not going to ask you to do this mathematical formula, but it is something to consider. So if say you have that great-grandmother's portrait in your foyer that's filled with beautiful light, that natural light can often degrade this portrait over time. Artificial light actually can as well, but again, throughout this talk, I want to give you practical tips and not just tips that make you feel overwhelmed with museum standards. So one of the things that I'll be recommending is you can look at a few different things, say for that great-grandmother's portrait. One is reproduction, meaning that you can do a scan of a photograph or a document and put it on display, but that can often be cumbersome and pricey. Instead, I might recommend that you rotate things in your foyer. Every few months, maybe move a different painting or a different document. This also serves to be able to highlight different things in your own family collection. It might be fun when people come over and say, I wonder what will be in that family spot right there. Is it a document? It is a painting. But light is something that we need to consider in terms of it degrades over time. The next thing I want to talk about is humidity. Again, coming from New Orleans, it was a little bit more of an issue there than it is here, but it still is a consideration. So humidity can often introduce both mold and mildew on the higher form, but also when things are too dry, they can tend to crack, they can become more brittle as well. So much like light, you'll hear me say again and again that the extremes aren't the ideal. We're really looking for a stability of an environment. So the Smithsonian standards are usually about 45 to 55% relative humidity, but I'm not expecting you to run around with a bunch of hygrometers testing what's in your living room and your attic and things like that. So again, the way to sort of easily test that is, am I comfortable in this environment? If I'm not comfortable, my artifacts might not be either. So again, starting to think about how can we move them from our attics and our basements up into the space where we ourselves are living as well. The final thing I want to bring up as a top tip for preservation is pests. I don't love talking about this. I won't go into all types of rodents and insects. Actually, it took me a little while to find the cutest image of a rodent that I could, because I didn't want you looking at it for like 5 or 6 minutes or so. But again, when we talk about rodents and insects, we could have a whole conversation about that, but it's really about awareness. So regularly checking your items, especially if they happen to be in the attics or the basements, to see if there might be some instances of rodent or insect interaction. They can often take the form of tiny holes. You might see more readily visible things like rodent pellets as well, but it's really essential to start treating this sooner rather than later, similar to the case of mold and mildew. If you happen to see an actual insect on that item, you have an active case. If that's the situation and you have 17 boxes of things, go ahead and take whatever that item is and put it into an enclosed space. Try to separate it from the rest of the items before you go through them, and that might help to sort of isolate the pest issue. It's really essential that you work with local pest control, but I'd also recommend that you can work with local museums or archives or even university archives if you have questions, who can provide recommendations about what's going on. It's amazing how helpful the museum and archive community can be if you write them and you say, hey, I found some holes in this document. What do you think I should do? They might not be able to get back to you within 24 hours, but they will respond with some helpful tips and tricks. We also do want to do some limited use of chemicals, so I don't want you to go up there every month and just start spraying Raid everywhere, because that can damage items. But really what I hope you take away from this is the importance of regular checks into the items just to see how they're doing. Because again, we might not look at these things as edible items, but there are a lot of rodents and insects who this is the best feast in the world, especially if there's glue involved. So again, these are 4 things that are sort of top tips of preservations that I want you to keep in mind as we move forward. So before we go into some specific at-home techniques, there are also a few recommendations for handling and care. So say you've got the light, the temperature, the humidity, and the pests in mind. Now what do you do when you open up that first of the 17 bankers boxes? What do you keep in mind when you start digging into that? The first one is to have clean hands. Now I'm sure you've all seen photos of people with those nice cotton gloves or nitrile gloves. Again, I'm looking at practical tips that you're able to do and not feeling sort of overwhelmed with museum standards. So one of the best things that you can do is simply have clean hands. So wash your hands with some soap that isn't scented. Make sure it's sort of free of lotions or perfumes, because all of those can transfer over along with the oils in our skin. So a lot of times you can just wash your hands with some natural soap that doesn't have some scent, and that's one of the best forms of protection that you can have. The next thing is to be gentle, which I know you might think, okay, Anna, you don't have to tell us to be gentle. We know we're dealing with some old items. But again, after you start going through things over time, it's just important again to think about treating things with a little delicate hand and delicate care. And there are a few things in our at-home techniques that I'll explain in terms of being gentle, because a lot of times things might look pretty sturdy and you pick them up and they they just crack or they crumble. And also, these things will happen. And I want to say this as someone who tries very hard to be gentle with items. Things that are in your care, they might crumble and they might crack, even with the best of intent. So this is really more of an emotional plea to let you know if that happens, it's okay. I know that you're doing the very, very best you can with those items, and it's all right, even if you're being very gentle. The next thing with handling care is actually to avoid certain types of plastics. It might be surprising to you because a lot of times those Tupperware bins, they keep out moisture, they keep out pests, which is very, very important. But what I would recommend is looking into the type of plastics, because there are some plastics that actually off-gas more, and off-gas means they release certain fumes that can actually degrade the items that are within them. So it's best to avoid PVC, which you'd be able to tell on the label, and use more things that are in the polyethylene and polypropylene categories. Usually if you see the word poly, it's a safer plastic. Again, if you've lost that label because you got that box 14 years ago, that's okay. You can often do a smell test. And if you smell it and it's super, super plasticky, maybe put it outside, let it off-gas a little bit, or try to find something else as well. You also want to try wherever you can to avoid tape and glue. So if something cracks and you're like, oh no, I have some Scotch tape, it's okay. You can put the tape away and keep those items next to each other. So the tape and the glue can sometimes degrade the item even further. And we'll talk about some alternatives to that in just a second. The final thing I wanted to mention is no chemical cleaning. And it's so tempting when you get this, this item and there's dirt on it and you're like, oh, if I can just get a scrub brush and some type of chemical cleaner, I'll have this ready in no time, can often damage the item even further. So we recommend mechanical cleaning, which means just using a soft brush, being able to go over it several times instead of sometimes even using water, which might introduce more moisture, especially if you immediately store it. So there are some very light brushes that you can use. A lot of times, again, not museum standards, but you can just use a new or clean soft makeup brush or a very soft toothbrush to get into those little corners, especially of ceramics and glass. But I highly recommend that you avoid the chemical cleaners that can sometimes degrade these items over time. And this really goes for everything from wood furniture to metals, and especially for photographs and documents. Okay, so now we're actually going to jump into the at-home techniques. So again, this is with remembering those 4 basic top tips of preservation as we go along. One of the things that I do want to say, for the at-home techniques, I'll be using the words acid-free from time to time. How many of you have heard of the acid-free or lignin-free materials? So those are available. They're available at a range of different sources as well. Again, these can be relatively affordable, but they can also be relatively very, very expensive. Any of you who have been on Gaylord Archival's website can see how expensive some of these acid-free items can be. So again, we're looking for practical tips. So there might be a situation where I'll recommend acid-free materials for your oldest or most sensitive or most precious to you in terms of memory items, but you don't necessarily have to use them for everything. Again, we're looking at stability. We're looking at what you can do in a very affordable environment. If you can work that into the budget, again, that's the standard. But again, doing a little bit is so much better than saying, oof, I don't have $500 to spend on these archival boxes, so I won't do anything at all. So again, we're looking at sort of these small steps that we can take in terms of preservation. Acid-free, again, doesn't have the degrading materials when it comes into contact with things. And acid-free can be folders, boxes, tissue paper, all sorts of materials, even holders for photographs as well. Okay, so what I want to do over the next couple of minutes is look at some of the biggest categories of items that you might find in your family collection and sort of look at how you can preserve them. So the first one is probably also the largest amount that you will find in those 17 bankers boxes that we've been talking about, and that is paper. And paper can take many, many different forms. They can be letters, they can be newspapers, they can be certificates, they can be business or personal correspondence. So paper spans the gamut in terms of items in the collection. One of the best things to do is, again, to think at some of these top tips in the handling and care is wherever possible to transfer them to some acid-free, but at the very least, get them out of some off-gassing material. So sometimes you'll see a lot of documents in Ziploc bags. Where possible, transferring those over to paper folders will already go a really, really long way in preserving some of these paper artifacts and paper treasures. The other thing is wherever possible to keep the documents flat. So you might have a lot of letters, and in fact, they're probably like all stacked in a long box of correspondence back and forth between people, and they're folded up in the envelopes. Over time, the longer an item is folded, the more it becomes rigid in that state, which means over the years, if you try to open it up, it might start breaking or cracking. So wherever possible, we recommend that you take these folded or bound items and lay them flat. Keep them with the envelope, because that envelope has a treasure trove of information as well. But wherever possible, definitely lay those flat. If they are cracking or crumbling, which can happen, especially with older materials, if you start to open it, and again, this is that be gentle handling, and you feel resistance, leave it as is. So it's better than sort of breaking it open and it comes into several pieces. If it's an especially rare item that you would like to invest in, you can talk with a conservator about what you might be able to do with that. But where possible, try to keep the paper items flat. The other thing that we recommend is to keep different types of paper separate. So the invitation, like say a baby invitation next to a handwritten letter with pen, over time those elements can actually come in contact and degrade or harm each other. So a lot of times you can just place a piece of paper, ideally acid-free paper, in between these different items. So if you have the handwritten letters, you just place a little piece of paper in between the next type of paper, especially when it comes to newspaper, which we'll talk about in just a second. The next thing is, how many of you have paper clips or staples in your family stuff? I certainly still do. So a lot of times you see over time that paper clip turns into a rusted paper clip. So ideally, if they're plastic or stainless steel, you can keep them on. They tend not to rust. But if they are rusted, we recommend taking it away from the rest of the items, brush it off with that super soft toothbrush that you have, and try to slowly remove it. Staples that are rusting, you can remove the prongs from the back so you're not ripping it out through. But getting those rusted materials away is ideal. Again, if things start to tear or break, leave it as is. But if it seems stable enough to remove, it definitely helps to remove those. And also one of the things that it pains me to let you know, but we have to avoid the temptation to laminate. I'm certainly guilty of laminating things in the past as well. You think this is great, I can run it under running water and this birth certificate won't go anywhere. But the combination of the materials and the heat used, it actually goes into the very fibers of the paper or the document. And then you have to use excessive heat and other mechanical force to remove it later. So we recommend that you don't laminate things. Now, if there are items in your collection that are laminated, that's okay. You know, you don't have to toss them into the trash by any means, but we just recommend moving forward that you keep a little bit of space from the lamination machine. And trust me, I know the lure and the pull of the lamination machine myself. I want to briefly talk about newspapers, because newspapers are things that we so commonly see in our family collection. And as you might also have seen, they tend to crumble the fastest. So they're the ones where you pick up and they just start to fall apart. And they are highly acidic, relatively speaking, due to the paper and the ink that's used in the newspaper printing. And one of the things that I often like to ask first is the clipping on its own, or is it within the entire newspaper? So again, we start thinking about the context of things. We really recommend that you focus more on individual clippings rather than the entire newspaper, because when you pass that on, sometimes the next generation or a friend might not know what you wanted to point out within that entire newspaper. And you might say, well, the context of this is so important, and I readily agree. So one of the things that we recommend is doing a quick search, even online, to see, has this newspaper been digitized? Universities, different libraries have an extraordinary number of digitized materials, which means you can feel pretty secure in having a clipping from that newspaper. However, if it's in your archive, if it's digitized, I don't recommend that you throw it away. It's an essential part of your family collection. It tells a story that's very readily accessible for you. So if you do have it, again, going back to that, keeping it separate from other types of materials, still have it, but separate it with an acid-free piece of paper just so it doesn't start degrading some of the other paper materials in addition. The other things that you can do are also photocopying or scanning it. That's a great way to have it readily available as a reference, but not keep that newspaper right next to a handwritten letter, say. The next thing I wanted to talk about, I know I'm moving a little bit quickly, but are photographs. So this is probably the second largest item that you might see in your collection, and it's one of my favorite things. The photos really do tell 1,000 words, but oftentimes there are 1,000 photos of 1,000 events in your collection, and so you're facing 750 photographs and you don't know what to do with them. One thing to say about photographs is they can degrade fairly rapidly when they're exposed to light, humidity, temperature, or pests. So I'm sure some of you might have experienced the clump of photographs where they start bending and then you try to flip through them and they're sticking together. So that's sort of a sign that they might have been exposed to a fluctuation in temperature or moisture. So again, wherever possible, trying to get these items separated and into archival materials, or at least separated from each other so they're not sticking and sort of tearing away at each other, is really important. Albums provide more space, certainly, but they can sometimes be more expensive as well. If you are overwhelmed, which I often am when I look at my own family photographs, look through and see if you can sort of organize them by event, and then choose 5 photos from that event and separate those by the individual pieces of paper. Keep the other ones, certainly. You don't have to, throw them out immediately. I don't recommend that, but sometimes starting these little steps of organization can help you get a 30,000-foot perspective. And it also doesn't make you feel like you have to buy 500 pieces of acid-free paper at the same time. So go through and sort of prioritize some of the photographs that you might want to preserve. Again, be as gentle as possible. Hold them on the side instead of on the top, because as you might have seen, your fingerprints can actually leave an impression on photographs over time. So wherever possible, you can even hold them with 2 hands instead. And one of the things that I do want to recommend is if you decide to move it out of an album, wherever possible, try to keep them inside an album, because the albums contain a lot of information, both with the handwritten notes next to them, but also the order that they were preserved in. So whomever put together that album put them together usually for an intentional purpose. So if you decide to remove them from that album, find a way to preserve what was next to it. Sometimes you can scan them in the album or take a photograph of them, but do consider that before you move them out. The one thing that I do want to do a special call out for are the self-adhesive or magnetic photo albums. I don't have an example up here, but we've all seen the kind where you put them and then you lay that nice thin film over and they're preserved forever. Unfortunately, they do degrade over time. You've probably seen that yellowing on the side, or worse, when you open it up, it starts sticking and then you can't tear it out. These are the only ones I do recommend, if you can, after you preserve the order and the information, to transfer them out of. Sometimes you can just use a little piece of Mylar or even an unscented, unwaxed piece of floss to sort of try to loosen that up a little bit. That can work well. If it starts to tear too much, leave it where it is. Again, like the staples and other things, you don't want to degrade it further. If it's an especially special photo, you can contact a conservator, but where possible, try to sort of move those over. Very briefly, slides, negative, other forms of film, they're even more sensitive than photographs. They really hate fluctuations in temperature, humidity. They like it cooler than almost any other artifact or treasure in your collection. So if you are looking for items to prioritize bringing down from your attic or up from your basement, I would recommend probably the negatives and the film and the tapes as well. And I would also recommend prioritizing transferring these to a different format, including slides. So going ahead and having those negatives transferred to the photographs, having the VHS transferred to an MP4, still keeping the original, but that will give you a little bit of peace of mind. Plus, it's so much easier for you to see, and you don't have to like hold it up to the light in your attic to see what event it's from. So again, they don't like hot temperature, sunlight, and they really don't like dust as well. The last thing that I'll talk about in regards to this are the objects. This is a very broad subject, certainly. This applies, to any 3D object. It can be fabrics, it can be metal, it can be glassware or ceramics. There are a range of standards, but again, it goes back to those 4 top tips of preservation. So thinking about the temperature, the light, the humidity, and avoiding pests. So one of the things that I think is particularly important with objects that doesn't always apply with documents or photographs that are often kept enclosed is you want to keep them free of dust wherever possible. It might seem a little bit bizarre, but dust can actually attract moisture, and that moisture can then degrade the item over time, even if it is a metal. So again, avoiding chemical cleaners, using a soft brush, but going over and sort of brushing, especially those really delicate swirls that you see on furniture or ceramic or glass, trying to keep those clean of dust wherever possible is important. And this is a space where you have to be really careful of the corners, careful of those small details as well, but just really taking your time. Sometimes I try to check in with myself and say, okay, am I really antsy and feeling like I have to rush through this? If I do, I sometimes don't work with 3D objects. I wait for a time where I'm like, you know what, I can almost make this a meditative project and slowly dust things away as I go along. So like paper, it's important that you keep different types of objects separated from each other. So metals, wood, textiles, sometimes those can degrade each other over time. So if you have a box full of, again, great-grandmother's portraits thing, and they're all together, you don't have to buy a separate box for every single item. Instead, wrapping those in acid-free tissue paper is often enough to keep them separated from each other so they don't degrade over time. Boxes can come in a range of prices if they happen to be archival. I would say even if you have those plastic tubs we talked about, keeping the objects in them but wrapping them in some sort of barrier can go a long way. So again, there's that museum standard, but we're really looking at what's practical and possible for everyone where they are. All right, so I know that I flew through that. I forget that I could spend like 4 hours talking about these things. So we're coming up at 45 past. So I just very briefly want to introduce the idea of preserving your family history for the future before going to the Q&A. So a few things that we want to consider when we're preserving our family history for the future are creating backup. So we've always heard that redundancy helps, right? And it's also true for your family treasures as well. So scanning, photographing, in other way, creating another form of that object can go a long way with creating peace of mind. Again, though, if you have those 500 photographs, Do not worry about getting overwhelmed with scanning every single one of the 500 photographs. Choose 5 and start with that. And then little bit by little bit, you can go back through. It's often wonderful when you're doing digital backups to have 2 different sources. So one is an external drive, the other can be cloud-based. Again, there's a range of considerations with that, which deserves its own talk, so I won't go deeply into it. But wherever possible, recruiting a friend or a family member to work with you on this, especially if they tend to post a lot of photographs, you might go to them and say, hey, can you help me with this digitization project? And it can, again, you can start very, very small. Any little bit helps. So again, digital backups are great. There are a range of very easy, affordable flatbed scanners that you can get to just start going through those. They can be 100 to 150, which I realize is not affordable for everyone, certainly, but even the phone, there are different ways that you can take photographs. So again, I'm thinking about what's the most accessible, practical way of doing some of these early digitizations wherever possible. The other thing to consider, again, is storage location. So if you have those items in your attic or the basement, starting to think about what are the ones I want to prioritize bringing into my living space where I'm comfortable and I'm living. Again, look them through for pests, another sign of damage, especially mold or mildew, but start thinking about bringing them in and also bringing them off of the floor as well. That is very, very helpful. The other important thing is it keeps it within your range of awareness. It puts things into a space where you don't just tuck it out of sight and out of mind and you think about it in 15 years, but it's something where it can start catching your awareness and you might start thinking, I want to do something with that. I want to start thinking about that a little bit more. If you have questions about offsite storage, we can certainly talk about that in the Q&A. There's a range of pros and cons related to that as well. The final thing is thinking about natural disasters. So this is not as much a consideration as it was for my almost 15 years in the American South, but it is important to think about possibly a go box, maybe a little box of those most precious of items that you want to keep in your awareness. But again, and I can't underestimate this or overestimate, excuse me, your life is the most important. So if there is a natural disaster, you are the holder of these stories. You are the one who has these within you. So please never go back in a natural disaster to get a box if you've forgotten it. Don't spend time collecting those things. But a lot of times when there's a natural disaster, people tend to rush around trying to collect these things, losing time where they can get themselves and their beloved ones out and into safety. So at all times, your safety is the most important. So I'm going to skip over the creating your family story and just move it on to this section, which is the importance when you organize things of how do you go about that. And you'll see some very basic steps through here. The first one I always recommend is planning. So you can walk in and get overwhelmed immediately by all of those boxes of things. But again, talking and sort of saying, what is my goal for this? Do I just want to reduce it so I know what's most precious to me? Do I want to create a book? Do I want to have a digital scrapbook? But if you almost have a goal in mind, that will help you rather than walk in and say, okay, organize. So really think about what do you want the outcome of this organization to be. The next thing, is the organizing. This can be the overwhelming part. So wherever possible, just start small. The first thing you can do is create an inventory. You open up that box, you can sort of glance through and have a very basic list of these are the types of things that are in this box. When you start, you don't have to open it and immediately create a detailed inventory of every single piece of paper that's in there if it overwhelms you. Again, thinking about what's the most possible in this aspect. So oftentimes I recommend doing a quick inventory over everything that you have, and then you can start digging in a little bit more deeply once you have that 30,000-foot perspective. The next thing to start thinking about is collecting. So once you sort of have a feel of this is the organization, this is how I want it to look, starting to see the gaps in your history. This is where you can start pulling in family members, collecting oral history, saying, saying, hey, this is a really bizarre document. Has anyone seen this before? This is probably one of my most fun parts, I would say, when it comes to family history, because this is when you start getting people involved in it, getting people interested in what you're doing and what you're organizing. As you're collecting, starting creating things. This can be a timeline. If you don't know where to begin, a lot of times I'll use objects as little milestones in a family's history or journey. You might start creating an online album of objects that you can share with each other. But one of the most helpful things to do is, once they're organized together, is creating a very quick summary. It can be one page, 2 pages, something very short about your family history, and it's that 30,000-foot perspective. Oftentimes, if collections come to us, I cry tears of joy when I see a family summary, because it's almost that encapsulation. And when we read it, we know it's not the full extent, but it's something that you can sort of wrap your mind around and start enabling you to sort of dig deeper into what you've organized and what you've collected. As you're doing this creation, also consider the context. So a lot of times we think of our families as these sort of isolated units moving through time, but just as we're connected to local and national and international events, the people who came before us were too. So starting to think about, what were the big events that might have been happening to these people over time? How does it connect? Do they show up in journals? Do they show up in photos? What might have been happening at the same time is a great thing to consider when you're creating. And then the last thing, and possibly the most fun thing apart from the collecting and the creating, is the sharing. Once you have that timeline, or once you have that online photo album, sharing it with people, the number of stories that come out of the sharing is extraordinary, including from the people where you say, hey, do you have any memories? And they're like, no. Then you can share that photo album and they say, wait a minute, I'd forgotten about that. I have this memory, which again goes back to the power of objects to help us tell these stories, that help us jog our memories as we move through time. So once you do that, then you can start inviting people to share their own stories as well. All right, so I know that was a whirlwind of preservation, so I wanted to pause now and open it up for Q&A, see if there are any answers that we can start exploring together. But we would love for you to connect with us at the Framingham History Center. Your family histories and stories help us tell the story of Framingham. So we are an actively collecting community, so if you have something that you might think you would like to donate to the Framingham History Center, we'd love to hear from you. Not everything can be held within our scope, but everything you have is important. So even if it's not a good fit for us, we'd love to work with you on how you can preserve it in your own family, or maybe connect you to other archives or institutions as well. So I'll pause there and ask if there are any questions.
Question about textiles. I have a cotton jacket from my mother from World War II. She was a nurse. And I don't know whether it's best to fold it with acid-free tissue paper. Right now I've got it hanging on a metal hanger. Most of the stuff I have is displayed in my house rather than put away in boxes, because I like it that way. But I don't know whether that's the best way to have it, hanging on a hook on the wall.
Great question. So the question for those online is what to do with textiles, how to store them, how to display them, especially if they're on hangers or not. This is a fantastic question. Actually, our collection manager, Rebecca Helgeson, has a world of experience with textiles. We'd love to hear from you if you have particular questions, just because she's a fantastic resource on that. So textiles, much like paper, oftentimes we try not to fold that, because sometimes the creases can sort of become more rigid over time. So wherever possible, unfolding things. I love to hear that you're displaying it. That means it's an active part of your life, which is fantastic. So again, trying to maybe move it out of natural light if it happens to be in there, or rotate it through from time to time. I do recommend maybe hanging it on a different type of hanger than metal, because again, the metal can interact sometimes with the fabric depending on the type, but we could recommend different types of hangers that are involved. With textiles, and this certainly might not be the case with you, if there are stains or things along that line, we do recommend not trying to treat them immediately or sort of tossing them in the wash again. You never said that, and I wouldn't I wouldn't think that you would ask that. But again, avoiding some of the chemical cleaning, but keeping it free of dust from time to time. So again, the brushes often aren't the best approach for the textiles in that. Sometimes you have to go even more gently with that. A lot of times there are often covers too. So it might be something where you rotate those through from time to time, and maybe every 6 months you let something rest off view and you put something else maybe in that precious space that you have displayed. But textiles, there are a lot of different considerations if it's sort of lace versus, wool or other things. So we would love to talk with you and work with you on that. So. Right. Any other questions? Yes.
I just opened 2 huge cartons. One has slides. My father took slides everywhere he went, other countries, everything. And the other was photographs. And there's no one left to help me identify some people in the photographs. And there's no way my kids are going to want to keep any of these. So I'm starting to digitize. And I have a little thing the first thing I put through the slides, I found a little box that said my sister's bat mitzvah. And that's really a long time ago. And I've run them through, I'm figuring out how to do this. But what do you do with lots of things that you don't want? Are there places where people would want slides from Russia, from Thailand, from China, that kind of thing? And are there people who want really old photographs for either artwork or projects or things like that?
Right. Another great question, which is about someone who's opened a box full of negatives and scans and slides, and they're depicting scenes, it sounds like from around the world, possibly from travels and other family events, and there might not be as much interest in your family of passing them along. So what do you do with these items, and are they of interest to other people? This is such an important question. I would say that the short and simple answer is yes, other people are interested. So the question is, how do you digitize that and then share it with those people? So I would say the online community is a wonderful community. This is a space where the genealogical community might be interested, or other archives or special interests. Every time when I talk about the online community, of course, it's considering being safe with your information, your security. So only going with sites that you have reviewed and you feel comfortable with, or sharing personal information that you feel comfortable sharing with those people, of course. But we have some fantastic genealogists at the Framingham History Center who help preserve. Oh, I'm not sure if it stopped. Oh, no, I think it popped back on again, who can help with some of that preservation. So there are certainly people who are interested. And one of the things we might be able to help you with is connecting with different communities who are interested. I know it sounds ridiculous, but even starting with a simple Google search for archives, so doing keyword searches for some of the scenes. So there might be a place where they traveled, and there might be an archive there. And they could be very interested in those photos from that time period in that decade. I certainly know from the different institutions where I worked, if someone came and said, hey, my family has these slides and they visited your city from overseas, I would be interested in hearing more about it. So there is a community for almost everyone, I would say. And I think it's one of the best way of sharing things, because people might not be interested in their family history even now or later on. And so I will also say sometimes people who are not interested now might become interested later on as well. So finding ways, again, that's where the narrative comes in. The digitization that you're already doing is laying the foundation in case your family becomes interested later on. But if they don't, there's an online community of people, certainly a community of people who could be very interested.
We do have a couple of online questions. Gail wonders, this is related to what you were just talking about, but I think maybe she means in real time, how can one record each photo so we know who the people in the photo are, date, and where they are?
Absolutely. So there are the sort of, in terms of the photographs, there are the two versions. One is the physical photograph, and then once it's been digitized as well. So with the physical photograph, the best practice is not writing or altering the photograph itself, if at all possible, but rather having it accompany another sheet of paper, ideally acid-free, written with graphite pencil that sort of describes what it is. If that is not possible, or if you're just like, nope, I'm not going to do that, using a graphite or 2B pencil and writing on the back of it very lightly so it doesn't poke through the photograph is helpful. Where possible, trying to avoid pen is ideal, even a Sharpie or a soft marker. I will say it's great when I flip over a photograph and I see everyone identified. That is very helpful, but avoiding writing who it is on the front of the photograph, even if it's underneath it. So doing sort of a left to right description is fantastic. When it's digitized, I won't go too deeply into this, but there is metadata. There are ways that you can also name the file itself that will identify it. So sometimes you can name the file with the family and the year, which is great, and have an accompanying sheet or document that goes into a little bit more detail. But oftentimes the digital formats have a lot more capacity for detail associated with an individual object. But it does take someone sort of helping with knowing how to do that, and a little bit more time and patience staring at a screen for hours on end. So.
And one more question, just textile question, suggestions for care of quilts. Should you find small holes or spots on handmade quilts which aren't antiques? And wondering if you're aware of local quilt repairers.
That's a great question. I am still new to the area, so I'm not aware of local quilt repairs. If you would send us an email, I'd love to pass that along to our curatorial and collection team, who I'm sure they've probably built up a range of different contacts that they would have that we could talk with. A lot of times quilts, again, avoiding the folding, but the rolling can often work. So sometimes there are these tubes, and you can actually roll it around the tube, which prevents a crease. So there are archival tubes, that you can roll them around. And again, you can layer it with acid-free tissue paper so each roll doesn't sort of contact or come into contact with the other. This is especially important if there are quilts that have embellishments. So if you have a quilt from the quote-unquote crazy quilt rage of the Victorian era, where they have all different types of materials and appliques and things like that, having that tissue paper protected as you're rolling it around makes it more compact, and also means you don't have to crease it.
Any other questions?
And if there are no other questions, I have one more having to do with big box. I have a photograph. Down at the bottom of this box, I found albums that my mother must have made. One of them has a wood cover with her initials on it, and another one is some kind of woven material. So the albums are really pretty, but when you open them up, the photographs were glued in. I think my father was really big on rubber cement. I'm not sure. But some of them are falling out. I don't know whether I should try fixing them or just leaving them alone.
That's a great question about some albums that are either wooden or fabric enclosed, but they might be starting to fall out here and there. There's some rubber cement that's involved. This is sometimes, I hate to say this, it's a case-by-case basis on how much it's falling out. If it's not plastic or it doesn't look like the photographs are degrading, so it's not that laminate material, sometimes it's best wherever possible. Like, is it sort of that black, almost like fabric-y type stiff board that you see?
It's black pages.
Okay, yep.
And then the photographs are just
Glued onto it. So with those, oftentimes they don't degrade as much as those laminate pages. So wherever possible, oftentimes those have a lot of handwritten notes here and there that's very hard to preserve. If it's just absolutely falling out, sometimes I might open it, take a photograph of it where it is, and that's a way of preserving it. So if they do fall out later, you at least have that photo record of it. But if there's a way to preserve that, sometimes it's better to keep that in the condition where possible. It's hard to say without seeing it itself, but if it's actively just falling apart, taking a photograph as you open it before putting them into acid-free envelopes. Sometimes you preserve the album, put what the photographs are inside that little envelope, acid-free envelope, and keeping it inside the folds is a way that you don't just take it out and you have like 180 loose photos and you're like, whew, hope I remember. Sometimes that's like an intermediary step that you can take. So,
So I just want to thank you, Anna. That was an incredibly wonderful and very informative presentation. And thank you all for coming. Thank you for those of you at home. For those who are here, I want to remind you about the evaluation forms in the back. And we hope to see you at future programs here at the library. Thanks again.
So much good information.
I'm so glad.
Where can I buy it? My father took a lot of slides and I have them in a box. Where could I buy a handheld slide viewer?
A slide? That's a great question. It might be, I don't know if you have access online, but sometimes even looking up slide viewers should provide a few things. I don't have any off the top of my head that I might recommend, but there are a few good slide viewers, even sort of portable ones that you can use just for looking for those. So.
Savers.